My parents kicked me and my kids out of Thanksgiving dinner, so I cut off their mortgage payments but… Ethan gripped the steering wheel as he pulled up to his parents' house, the warmth of the golden autumn leaves on the ground starkly contrasting with the cold knot forming in his stomach. Thanksgiving had always been a complicated affair, but this year, with everything that had happened between him and his family, he told himself that things would be different, that they would at least try. The kids, Noah and Sophie, bounced in the back seat, chattering excitedly about pumpkin pie and Grandma's famous stuffing. They didn't know the tension that lingered beneath their father's smile as he unbuckled them and guided them up the porch steps. The door opened before Ethan could even knock, and there stood his mother, Susan, with an expression that immediately set him on edge. "Oh," she said, her mouth curving downward in something that wasn't quite a frown, but certainly wasn't welcoming. "You're here." Ethan swallowed the sharp response that wanted to slip out. Instead, he forced a smile. "Yeah. Happy Thanksgiving, Mom." Susan stepped aside stiffly, letting the three of them enter. The house smelled like roasted turkey, cinnamon, and buttered rolls, a scent that should have been comforting but felt strangely foreign this year. Inside, the atmosphere was different, colder, more distant. The usual warmth of family gatherings was absent. His father, Robert, sat at the head of the table, speaking in hushed, amused tones with Jessica and her husband, Mark. Jessica, his younger sister, turned her head slightly at the sound of the door but didn't get up. Her face lit up when she saw the kids, but when her eyes met Ethan's, the brightness dulled. Ethan cleared his throat. "Hey, everyone." Silence. Then Jessica gave a smile that was so thin it could shatter. "Oh, you actually came." Ethan frowned. "Yeah, of course we came. It's Thanksgiving." His father finally looked up, his expression unreadable. "Well, we just didn't expect you." Before Ethan could respond, Sophie tugged on his sleeve, her little voice bubbling with excitement. "Daddy, where do we sit?" Ethan turned toward the dining table, his stomach sinking. There were place settings. Crystal glasses filled with sparkling cider, fine china, napkins folded neatly into little swans. But there were only 6 places set. One for Robert, one for Susan, one for Jessica, one for Mark, one for their son, Tyler, and an extra, presumably for Jessica's newborn daughter, though she wasn't old enough to sit at the table. There were no plates for Ethan or his children. The room felt suddenly smaller. Ethan forced himself to speak, though his voice came out a little too rough. "I don't see our seats." His mother sighed, as if he was being unreasonable. "Oh, Ethan, we didn't know if you'd come. And well, we had to make sure there was enough space for everyone." Ethan's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "We're family," he said, voice low but steady. "There should be space." Jessica let out a quiet, mirthless laugh, shaking her head. "Ethan, you haven't exactly acted like family lately." That did it. The undercurrent of hostility, the carefully masked resentment. He knew this wasn't just about a lack of space. It was punishment. A deliberate act to show him that he was no longer fully welcome. His kids were watching, confused. "Grandma," Noah spoke up, hesitant. "Can we sit on the couch and eat? We don't need a big table." Ethan's heart squeezed painfully. His 8-year-old son, already trying to compromise, trying to make it okay when it absolutely was not. His mother let out a breath through her nose, like she was being asked something inconvenient. "I suppose I could set up something in the kitchen," she said. "There's a small table there, but it's really for extra dishes, so it'll be a bit tight. And you'll have to serve yourselves since we've already got everything arranged in here." Tight. Separate. Lesser. Ethan glanced toward the large dining table. There was room. Maybe it would be a little crowded, but there was room. If they had wanted him and the kids there, they would have found a way. This wasn't an accident. This was a choice. Jessica, meanwhile, was looking far too pleased with herself. She sat comfortably in her seat, in her perfect little spot at the table, while her brother and his children were being treated like afterthoughts. Something inside Ethan burned. He took a slow breath, kneeling so that he was at eye level with his kids. "You know what?" he said, keeping his voice light for their sake, even as rage churned beneath the surface. "I think we're going to have our own special Thanksgiving." Sophie's eyes widened. "Really? Really?" He smiled, but there was no warmth in it as he stood up and turned back to his parents. "Thanks for the invitation. But we'll eat somewhere where we're actually wanted." His mother's eyes widened. "Ethan, don't be so dramatic." "Dramatic?" He let out a bitter laugh. "You didn't even set a plate for my kids. For me. What exactly did you expect me to do? Thank you for letting us eat scraps in the kitchen while you all sit together like a perfect little family." Robert sighed heavily, as if this was his fault, as if he was the one ruining things. We were just trying to keep things simple. No, Ethan said, his voice finally sharp. You were trying to remind me of my place. And I got the message loud and clear. Jessica looked almost smug. Ethan grabbed his kids' coats, ushering them toward the door, his heart pounding. He didn't know where they were going, but anywhere was better than this house, this table, this family that had already decided he didn't belong. As he walked out the door, Noah's small hand curled into his, squeezing. It's okay, Dad, his son whispered. We can still have Thanksgiving. Ethan blinked hard, keeping his voice steady. Yeah, buddy. We sure can. And with that, he walked out into the cold November evening, his children by his side, leaving behind the family who had left them out in the first place. Ethan drove in silence, gripping the steering wheel as his children sat in the back, still wearing their little Thanksgiving outfit. The injustice of the evening sat heavy on his chest, boiling under his skin like a slow, seething rage. He wasn't sure where he was taking them yet, but he knew he couldn't let them see how angry he was, how deeply this had cut him. Noah and Sophie, bless their hearts, were resilient. They were already whispering about stopping for burgers, or maybe finding a diner that had pie. They were making the best of it, and Ethan was grateful. But he was done. Done pretending. Done shouldering the weight of a family that treated him like an outsider. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. For years, he had been financially supporting his parents, making sure they could stay in that house. The same house that he had just been turned away from like some kind of unwelcome guest. Every month, $800 left his account to cover their mortgage. He had been paying their property taxes, too, because his father had needed a little help one year, and somehow that help had never stopped. Every time the roof leaked, every time the water heater failed, every time they needed anything, Ethan had been the one to step in. His parents had never even asked Jessica or Mark to contribute a dime. And yet, tonight, they couldn't even set a plate for him and his children. His jaw tightened as he pulled into a quiet diner, the neon open sign flickering in the dark. Come on, guys, he said, forcing his voice to stay even. Let's go have a real Thanksgiving dinner. The kids cheered, and for them, he kept his anger buried, for now. But the next morning, when Ethan woke up in his own house, the rage was still there. Settled in his bones, simmering. He pulled up his bank statements, scrolling through months of payments, proof of every sacrifice he'd made for parents who had just humiliated him in front of his children. He stared at the numbers, at the money that could have gone toward Noah and Sophie's future. Instead, it had gone to a family that had made it clear he didn't belong. His mother called that afternoon. She didn't ask how the kids were. She didn't apologize. Instead, she sighed dramatically and said, "You left so suddenly last night." Jessica was really upset. It was supposed to be a family dinner, Ethan. Ethan let out a bitter laugh. Yeah? It didn't feel like a family dinner to me. Oh, don't be like that, she scolded. We weren't expecting you, and things were already arranged. We can't just rearrange everything at the last second. You had 6 place settings, Mom. His voice was sharp now. You could have added 3 more. You didn't want to. She didn't deny it. She just sighed again, like he was the one being difficult. You know how things are, Ethan, she said in that tired, passive way of hers. Jessica has a lot on her plate. The new baby, Tyler starting school, Mark working all those hours. We just thought it would be nice for them to have a stress-free holiday. Ethan's grip on the phone tightened. Right. Because my life is so easy. Because raising 2 kids on my own is a walk in the park. Now, don't be dramatic. He cut her off. You know what? Let's talk about something real for a second. You know that house you're living in? The one you were so comfortable shutting me out of last night? She hesitated. What about it? I'm done paying for it. Silence. A long, stunned pause. What? You heard me, Ethan said, his voice steady, firm. No more mortgage payments. No more property taxes. No more repairs. No more free money from the son you can't even be bothered to set a damn plate for. The panic in her voice was immediate. Ethan, you can't just. I can, he interrupted coldly. And I am. Another beat of silence, and then, as he expected, his father's voice cut in. Ethan, don't be ridiculous. Ethan almost laughed. Of course she had gone running straight to Dad, like he was supposed to fall in line now. I'm not being ridiculous, he said. I'm being fair. You've treated Jessica like royalty her entire life, while I've been the one keeping this family afloat. But last night? That was it for me. I'm done paying for people who don't even want me around. His father scoffed. We never asked you to pay for any of this. No, but you let me, Ethan shot back. You let me sacrifice my own family's financial security while you played house with Jessica and her perfect little family. And the second I stopped being useful, you didn't even have the decency to offer me a chair at your table. His mother's voice was thin, pleading now. Ethan, we didn't mean to hurt you. You're still our son. He shook his head, even though they couldn't see him. No. I'm your wallet. And I just closed. The weight of his words settled heavily between them. For the first time in years, Ethan felt like he was in control. And then came the final blow. Jessica's voice burst through the receiver, sharp and furious. Are you seriously this petty? Ethan almost smiled. There she was, the real Jessica. No fake sweetness, no passive-aggressive politeness. Just raw, entitled rage. You owe Mom and Dad, she snapped. After everything they've done for you. Everything they've done for me? Ethan's voice was dangerously low now. You mean the way they made me responsible for keeping a roof over their heads while they handed you everything? Oh, come on, Jessica sneered. Like you didn't want to help. Don't act like you're some kind of martyr. You make plenty of money. I make plenty of money because I work my ass off, Ethan interrupted, his voice now sharp and cutting. Unlike you, who has Mom and Dad footing the bill for everything. And guess what, Jess? That ends today. You want to be the favorite? Fine. Then you can start paying their mortgage. Jessica's outrage sputtered for a moment. That's not fair. Ethan let out a humorless laugh. Oh, so now we're talking about fairness? His father spoke again, his voice quieter, more controlled. Ethan, let's not do anything drastic. Let's talk about this. Ethan's stomach twisted. He wanted to believe them. He wanted to believe that if he stayed on the line a little longer, they would finally see him. Finally appreciate him. But he knew better now. I've already talked enough, he said. My decision's final. Have fun figuring it out. And with that, he hung up. The phone rang twice more, but Ethan didn't answer. Instead, he sat back, staring at the ceiling, feeling something he hadn't in a long, long time. Relief. For the first time in years, he was free. Ethan didn't think about his family for a while after cutting them off. Not really. It had been easier than he expected, like dropping a weight he hadn't realized he'd been carrying for years. Sure, the phone calls had continued for a while, his mother leaving voicemails in her usual exasperated, guilt-laced tone, his father trying to sound reasonable, Jessica alternating between venom and entitlement. But he ignored them. For the first time in years, his paycheck was his own. No mortgage payments disappearing into a house that wasn't his. No emergency repairs sucking away money he could be saving for Noah and Sophie's future. The weight was gone. And then, one evening, it all came crashing down. Ethan had just put the kids to bed when his phone lit up with a name he hadn't seen in months. Mark. Jessica's husband. Ethan frowned. He debated ignoring it, but curiosity won out. He answered. Mark's voice was tense, rushed. Ethan. Mark. There was silence. Then a deep breath. Jessica's in trouble. Ethan exhaled sharply. That's not really my problem. It is if you want to see karma in real time. That made Ethan pause. He leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. Go on. Mark let out a bitter laugh. She lost her job. Ethan raised an eyebrow. I thought she was Miss Perfect. Big-time executive. Making 6 figures. Yeah, well, turns out she wasn't as perfect as she made everyone think. Mark's voice was laced with bitterness. She got caught skimming company funds. Not outright theft at first, just little things here and there. Reallocating budgets, padding expense reports. But then she got greedy. They started digging and found some serious irregularities. She's being investigated for embezzlement. Ethan blinked. He had expected Jessica to crash eventually, but this? She could go to jail, Mark continued. They haven't pressed charges yet, but it's only a matter of time. And guess what? We're broke. Ethan almost laughed. Broke? What happened to all those bonuses? The vacations? The designer clothes? Mark's voice tightened. She spent everything. And I mean everything. I didn't even know how bad it was until last week when I tried to use our credit card and it got declined. Turns out, she maxed out everything trying to keep up the illusion that she was still in control. Meanwhile, she's drinking like a fish, barely leaves the house. She's a mess, Ethan. And your parents? They're losing it. They called me earlier, begging me to convince you to help. That made Ethan pause. Help? Yeah, Mark said, a sharp edge to his voice. Because apparently, even after everything, they still expect you to fix it. Ethan let out a slow, dark chuckle. Unbelievable. Oh, it gets better, Mark said dryly. They're terrified that if Jessica gets charged, it'll ruin the family name. They don't give a damn about what she actually did, they just don't want to be embarrassed. But they have no money to bail her out, no connections to make it go away. He hesitated. Honestly? I don't even know if I want to help her. That caught Ethan off guard. You're her husband. For now. Mark's voice was cold. But you should see her, Ethan. She's not the same person. Or maybe this was always who she was, and I was just too blind to see it. Ethan had nothing to say to that. Mark sighed. Anyway, I thought you'd want to know. It's bad, Ethan. Really bad. Ethan thought about it for a moment, then shrugged. She made her bed. There was silence. Then Mark let out another bitter laugh. Yeah. I figured you'd say that. They ended the call, and Ethan put his phone down, staring at the wall for a long moment. Jessica. Perfect, untouchable Jessica. Falling apart. For a brief moment, Ethan felt satisfaction. This was what she deserved after all those years of looking down on him, of sneering at his struggles while she lived off their parents' favoritism. But then he thought about Noah and Sophie. About the way Jessica had smiled when she saw them that night at Thanksgiving, before her expression had hardened, before she had shut him out. And he wondered if there was anything left of his sister beneath all that arrogance and greed. Over the next few weeks, Ethan started hearing things through the grapevine. Jessica had been officially fired. The company issued a vague but pointed statement about financial irregularities, and rumors spread like wildfire. People whispered that she had stolen hundreds of thousands, maybe more. Her name was dragged through every local business circle. Her so-called friends, the ones she had bragged about in her high-rise apartment over fancy wine, gone. Mark moved out. Took Tyler with him. And Jessica? Jessica was spiraling. She started drinking more, first quietly, then openly. She was seen stumbling out of bars, her once polished look replaced with disheveled clothes and dark circles under her eyes. She had pawned some of her expensive handbags and jewelry, trying to scrape together enough money to stay afloat. But it was never enough. Then one day, Ethan's mother called again. This time, he answered. She's sick, Ethan. Susan's voice was frantic. She's not eating, she's not sleeping. She lost everything. Mark left, the house is being foreclosed on, and we don't know what to do. Ethan took a slow breath. So now you need me. His mother sniffled. She's your sister. Was I her brother when she left me and my kids out in the cold? Ethan asked, his voice sharp. Was I your son when you let it happen? Silence. Ethan. His father's voice came through the line now. This isn't the time for grudges. She needs family. Ethan almost laughed. She had family. She just didn't want it. A pause. Then his father sighed. Look, just please, Ethan. At least go see her. Talk to her. If you won't do it for us, do it for the kids. They love their aunt. Ethan exhaled slowly. He knew he should just hang up. Just walk away. But for some reason, he didn't. Jessica's house was almost unrecognizable. The pristine yard was overgrown. The luxury car she used to flaunt had been repossessed. The blinds were drawn, and when Ethan knocked, it took minutes before the door cracked open. Jessica stood there barefoot, her once flawless hair a tangled mess. The expensive silk robe she wore was stained, her face hollowed out from stress and drinking. Her eyes widened when she saw him. Ethan? He crossed his arms. Mom and Dad called. Her lip curled. Of course they did. He didn't move. Can I come in? Jessica hesitated, then sighed and stepped aside. The inside of the house was worse. Empty liquor bottles on the counter. Unopened mail, probably foreclosure notices, piled up. The air smelled stale, like she hadn't bothered to open a window in weeks. She slumped onto the couch. So what? You're here to rub it in. Ethan sat across from her, watching her carefully. I want to know why, he said finally. You had everything, Jess. Why did you throw it all away? She let out a bitter laugh. Because I thought I was untouchable. She picked up a half-empty glass, swirled the dark liquid inside. I thought I'd always be the favorite, she murmured. That no matter what I did, someone would clean up the mess. She looked up at him then, and for the first time in years, Ethan didn't see arrogance. He saw regret, and for the first time, he wondered if there was still something left to save. Ethan was in his kitchen making dinner for Noah and Sophie when his phone rang again. He saw the caller ID, his mother, and let out a slow breath. It had been weeks since he last spoke to her, weeks since he had gone to see Jessica in the wreckage of her once perfect life. He had no doubt why she was calling now. He let it ring. It rang again, and again. On the fourth call, he answered. Ethan, Susan's voice was already thick with desperation. We need to talk. Ethan stirred the pasta, keeping his tone flat. I'm listening. His mother hesitated, then exhaled shakily. The bank sent us a notice. We're behind on the mortgage. Ethan closed his eyes. He had seen this coming. The moment he stopped covering the payments, the moment Jessica's financial empire crumbled, it was only a matter of time. How far behind? He asked, even though he already knew the answer. 3 months. Her voice cracked. They're going to foreclose if we don't come up with the money. Ethan's jaw tightened. I told you I was done. But we thought, she choked on her words. We thought Jessica would be able to help if you wouldn't. Ethan let out a bitter laugh. Jessica? The same Jessica who can barely afford to keep the lights on in her own house? The same Jessica who drank away what little money she had left. There was silence on the other end. Then Robert, his father, got on the line. His voice was colder, harder. Ethan, this is your childhood home. The house we raised you in. You're really going to let it be taken? Ethan gripped the counter, his knuckles white. You didn't seem too worried about that when you let me and my kids eat dinner in a diner on Thanksgiving. His father's voice sharpened. That was different. No, Ethan shot back. It wasn't. That was you making it clear where I stand in this family. And now that you're losing something, suddenly, I'm supposed to care. His mother broke in, her voice frantic. Please, Ethan. We'll pay you back. We just need some help getting caught up. Ethan let out a slow, measured breath. How much? There was a pause. 25,000, she admitted weakly. Ethan laughed, but there was no humor in it. That's not getting caught up, Mom. That's drowning. His father's voice turned cold. You have the money. That's right, Ethan said, his voice sharp. I do have the money. And I'm using it for my kids. Not for you. Not anymore. His mother started crying. Please, Ethan. We have nowhere else to go. We'll lose everything. Ethan's grip tightened. For years, he had been the safety net. The one who fixed things, who made sure they never had to feel discomfort. They had used him like an ATM, never once considering how it affected him. And now, when the real consequences were closing in, they were scrambling, not because they regretted how they treated him, but because they needed him. He took a breath and said, Sell the house. His mother gasped. What? You can't afford it, Ethan said. Even if I covered this payment, what about next month? The month after that? You've been living beyond your means for years. Sell it. Move somewhere smaller. His father scoffed. That house is worth nearly $500,000. And you expect us to, what? Buy some tiny apartment like we're poor? You are poor, Ethan said bluntly. You just didn't realize it until I stopped funding your life. His mother sobbed harder. This isn't fair, Ethan. We did everything for you. Ethan closed his eyes, his chest tightening with years of pent-up anger. No, Mom. I did everything for you. And you never appreciated it. The only time I mattered was when you needed money. There was silence. Then his father muttered, so that's it? You're going to let us lose everything. Ethan let out a breath and looked over at his kids, happily eating dinner at the table. Yes, he said simply. I am. And then he hung up. The next few weeks were a slow-motion car crash. Ethan heard bits and pieces through Mark, who had finally finalized his divorce from Jessica. The foreclosure process had officially begun. The bank had sent their final warnings, and soon, the house Ethan had paid for all these years would no longer be theirs. His parents tried everything. They called other family members, but no one was willing to loan them that much money. They tried to get Jessica to beg Mark for help, but he shut that down immediately. His father even tried getting a loan, but with no income, no savings, and massive debt, no bank would touch them. Then, one day, Ethan was at the grocery store when he ran into his mother. She looked awful. The expensive clothes she used to wear were gone, replaced with something cheap and wrinkled. Her eyes were puffy, her hair unkempt. She looked like a woman who had aged 10 years in a month. Ethan, she said, her voice small. He sighed. Mom. She looked around, as if making sure no one was listening, then whispered, We're leaving the house next week. They're taking it. Ethan just nodded. She swallowed, tears brimming in her eyes. Where do we go? Ethan raised an eyebrow. Not my problem. Her face twisted. How can you be so cold? Because I spent years keeping you comfortable while you treated me like an afterthought, he said evenly. And now, for the first time in my life, I'm choosing myself. She let out a shaky breath. I never thought it would come to this. Ethan tilted his head. Did you think the money would never run out? She bit her lip, but said nothing. Then, finally, her shoulders slumped. We have to move in with Jessica. Ethan blinked, then laughed. His mother flinched. Don't laugh. I'm sorry, Ethan said, still grinning. But you think Jessica can support you? She can barely support herself. She's drowning in debt. Mark left her. She's barely holding on to her own house. His mother clenched her fist. We have no other options. Ethan shrugged. Then I guess you'll have to live with the consequences of your choices. Tears spilled down her face, but Ethan felt nothing. For years, he had given. Given money. Given time. Given love to people who only saw him as a tool. Now, the roles had reversed. And they couldn't handle it. As he turned to leave, his mother grabbed his arm, her voice cracking. We're still your parents. Ethan looked at her. Then, with finality, he said, Not anymore. And he walked away, leaving her standing there, crying in the grocery store aisle.